Meeting of the James City County Board of Supervisors work session to order. Good afternoon, everyone. We have the Planning Commission joining us this afternoon, and we will turn that over to Mr. Richardson to introduce in just one moment. But Mr. Porter, if you could call the roll.
Mr. McMillan? Here. Ms. Eisenhower? Here. Zip? Here. Ms. Savage?
Here.
Ms. Larson?
Here. If you could pass that, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Mr. Holt, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Leverins.
Here.
Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. O'Connor.
Here.
Mr. Krupp.
Here.
And Mr. Richards.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's great to see you this afternoon. As always, it's a wonderful time to be able to come to the table and kind of share with you what we're looking at and certainly be able to answer any questions that you may have and any direction you may offer. So I think we will go ahead now and turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
So first on our agenda today is the Joint Board of Supervisors and Planning Commission work session. And I'm going to start with Ms. Ellen Cook, who is going to introduce our agenda item number 1, which is our Fort Eustis Joint Land Use Study.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Commission and Board. Over the past 16 months, work has progressed on creating the Fort Eustis Joint Land Use Study, or JLUS. The JLUS has been a collaborative study conducted by 3 surrounding localities, federal officials, residents, and Fort Eustis to identify compatible land uses and growth management guidelines near the installation. The JLUS has been guided by a policy committee and a technical working group and has included significant outreach and input opportunities for the public. A 30-day comment period for the final draft of the JLUS recently concluded. Mr. Ray Greer with the consulting firm Stantec and the team's project manager is here this afternoon to provide you with an overview of the study and recommendations. Following the work session, staff will place this item on the agenda for final consideration by the Planning Commission at its June meeting and by the board at its July meeting. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Greer.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to y'all. So the Joint Land Use Report, everybody's seen it, the paper copy. I know y'all were sent, I think, a link to a digital copy. And once it's final, we are going to give everybody a paper copy. They'll have a nice hard copy to be able to flip through and read. But hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at it. What I want to do today is kind of go through it, just show you, briefly what it's combined, what it consists of, what it's made of, and then answer any questions you may have associated with it. And one of the things we'll do is really talk about the overall joint land use study, but also focus on James City County and some of the recommendations that apply to you directly. Overall, as Ellen had mentioned, the joint land use study involves York County, James City County, and the city of Newport News. So it's a pretty substantial area, and I'll show you the study area here in just a second. But it is a very collaborative approach, analyzing not only the encroachment of the installation, but also how the installation encroaches into the community, and letting everybody look at it and then come to the table and work together on some solutions, which you'll see in a little bit is the recommendations that is formed through this. But the joint land use study itself, as I mentioned, it really is a comprehensive approach, and it brings everybody to the table. You've got elected officials, you've got the planners, you've got people from the military there. They're all at the table working through what the items are, not only, first of all, identifying the items, but then working through what the solutions will be, which ultimately becomes the recommendations. And they vary. They vary from James City County to the city of Newport News, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. And then also what some of the solutions are. The report itself consists of 10 chapters. And I'll go through kind of like broad what the chapters are, so you kind of have an understanding of what the makeup is of the study. And so you can kind of understand how it's put together and what it becomes in the end, which is the recommendations and why that's important. The overview of the joint land use is chapter 1, and basically that chapter kind of sets the large framework of the joint land use, identifies what it is, what the study area is. As you can see, the study area is a funny looking boundary. The area in yellow is the study area. Fort Eustis is down there in the southwest portion of it that's still in tan. And it goes to the northeast, which that eagle head, that's York County. And then, of course, there's a part of the very northern piece that is also in York County. And then everything south of there, of course, is in James City County. And then everything to the southeast is located in the city of Newport News. And when we started this process, York County was not in it. It was James City County and the city of Newport News. And then York County came to the table after we began, actually, by the time we had our first meeting in January of 17. And they came in, not so much that they're affected by the mission of Fort Eustis, but more that the military lives mainly, and interacts in York County up in that area that is that Eagle's Head. And it's an area that they felt that they were being influenced from the military. So we brought them in to be able to analyze what's going on up there in terms of housing and if there is interactions or effects up there from the military in that area and vice versa. And, it also gave us the opportunity to analyze, is the military's mission up in that area too? And, and I'll go through it a little bit later, but we did not determine that the mission affected that area at all. But the next chapter in the Joint Land Use Report itself is public involvement. And when we did this, it says 3 public workshops. We did 3 series of public workshops. When we had a public workshop, we had one in James City County, and we had one associated with either the county, the city, or the military. And then also, we have a website, we have a Facebook page, and the website Facebook page is live and has been live since December of 2016, and will remain up. It will remain up as it goes through implementation after the joint land use process. So when we're done and complete the study, we will turn over the website back over to the project administrator, who is the City of Newport News, and then they'll coordinate the involvement of that website and the Facebook page. And then in addition is a community survey. We did do community surveys as we went through the process. It is a survey, be able to capture people that won't come to the meetings, to be able to get the word out. And as you can see, we attended 10 separate events, both in James City County, York County, and in City Newport News, just like that table set up. We set up tables, passed out surveys, encouraged people to fill them out, and then processed them. And we used them as we went through the process, presented them back to the technical working group and back to the policy committee, and used that input throughout this study. It's a very valuable piece of information to be able to grab people who traditionally or typically won't come to a traditional workshop. Community profile is a section that's in the Joint Land Use Report. Every entity, James City County, York County, City of Newport News, they all have their own section that kind of displays what's in that area, what's in that, if it's the county or the city, what it is, what it's made up of, and how it fits into this joint land use study. Very, very important piece to understand the overall joint land use report. And then, of course, Fort Eustis. They have their own section in there, describes the mission, goes into detail about the history of Fort Eustis and why Fort Eustis is there and what its overall goal is in the big realm of the military, what its action, function, role is. And of course, most of y'all know Fort Eustis serves a very valuable piece, being the transportation arm of the Army. And, not only is that transportation, it's also water related too. And I'll get into a little bit how that's so important, also be able to maintain the waterways around Fort Eustis and to maintain their mission. But one of the big items of the Joint Land Use Report is being able to look at compatibility. Naturally, compatibility is ultimately what happens around military installations. You have either compatibility issues. It's either driven by the community or it's driven by the military, and it's vice versa. Again, as I mentioned, the important part of a joint land use study is being able to analyze and look at areas around the installation, determine if there's compatibility issues, and then work together to develop solutions, long-term proactive planning solutions. And it's not only issues that occur today, but issues that could occur in the future. And it's very important that we identify as a group, the technical working group and the policy committee, these items to be able to work out what the real solutions are. And as I mentioned, the recommendations are actually fall into the report. In this map, there's a lot going on in this map, and I will explain it to you a little bit so you can understand really what the study area and how we drill down into the study area. There's about 10 more slides that builds to this slide, but in an effort of time, we put the main slide up. And what we have here is, you notice that the study area has been substantially reduced. And what we did was focus in on the mission of Fort Eustis. And what you see in that dashed line that kind of goes outside and around the overall boundary, that's a makeup of a couple things. One of them being is the airspace of Fort Eustis. Fort Eustis operates and trains helicopter pilots, and they have an active airspace that they monitor that falls inside that perimeter, that buffer area that goes in there. And then a portion of it also is Newport News, Williamsburg International Airport airspace. They overlap, and they have to communicate, coordinate together. And then in addition to it is the training areas that occur in the James River, which is what pushes that boundary all the way over to the edge of the shoreline on the other side. And then the 3 circles you see. The 3 circles are 3 different areas that, as we went through this process, came to the forefront of being some of the major items in the joint land use study. And the one to the south is their gun range. They have a gun range located on Fort Eustis, and of course it has noise zones that do not leave the installation. But given the makeup of the installation with that peninsula and the water body that goes across, the sound does travel. And we heard a lot, just a Newport News issue, but we heard a lot from them, the people who live over there, about hearing the gun range and just different training activities that go on down there. So we have a whole set of recommendations that associated with that. But as you go up to the north, you see the smaller circle. The smaller circle is the main gate. And the main gate, again, is located solely, that issue, and it's the 1,000-foot buffer zone for the main gate, for anti-terrorism force protection standards, be able to maintain that. And that occurs, that 1,000 feet occurs totally in the city of Newport News. And then as you go over a little bit to the west, in that very top, the bigger circle you see, that is the 3rd port. And that's Fort Eustis 3rd Port. It is located up on Skips Creek, in between and adjacent to James City County. And that is a piece that we'll spend some time talking about with the recommendations and what applies to that. And some of the items that occurred there and what came to the top through doing this compatibility analysis. And then what we talked about as being solutions to address what some of these issues could be long term. And in the compatibility analysis itself, there's 19 items, 19 areas of interest that occurred. And these 19 items are throughout the entire study. Not all of them occurred to James City County by no means. And what we'll do is some of them actually get combined. When we go through and talk about some of the recommendations, they kind of roll up because they're related to each other and can be addressed through some of the same recommendations. And in these recommendations, again, as I mentioned, that 3rd port area, it actually goes, and there's a combination of things that are going on there. You have, as you can see, the dashed line that's up to the top. You have their Fort Eustis airspace for Faulkner Field. That's their area that they maintain and control the airspace inside of that. And they actively have helicopters maneuvering in and out of that airspace. And then you also have the training areas that occur in the James River and in Skips Creek. And the training areas are just like the fly areas with the helicopters. They're not only Fort Eustis. What we're seeing and what we learned through doing the Joint Land Use Report was you've got the Navy coming up from Norfolk. They're coming up flying helicopters up over here and doing touch and goes on Fort Eustis and on Williamsburg International Airport. They're also using that runway. But they're also doing training missions up in the James River, utilizing both Skips Creek and the James River. And what they're doing is doing exercises that they're no longer able to do down in Virginia Beach. Fort Story is actually doing a lot more training up here because they've been able to do it in the James River and not have the compatibility issues they now have down in Virginia Beach. And then in addition, the 3rd port itself also does a lot of training, and it's different forces coming in. They utilize Skips Creek. And Camp Perry comes over and does training there, and then different branches of the military are also doing training. And they use Skips Creek and that port to not only train between the waterways naturally, from the port over to the reserve fleet that's out in the James River. They're also utilizing that for different training missions and going back and forth. And then naturally, their training area goes further up to the north that runs along the James River into James City County. So some of the recommendations that occur through that, and one of the things that really started as you go back and look at what's brought the process on, what established the reason to do the joint land use study. There's never been a joint land use study for Fort Eustis. This has never been done, which is interesting. A lot of installations, especially older installations that are located in more urbanized areas, have a joint land use study. Langley has a study. Langley was actually done in 2010, right before the 2 bases combined. It became joint base Langley-Eustis. So Langley has a current joint land use study. Fort Eustis does not have one and has never had one. So this is actually their first study. And then some of the things that actually brought this to a head, of course, is communication, coordination. You always have that. And James City County, York County, and City of Newport News, they do a good a good bit of communication with the installation. And this stuff we don't see all the time. Not everybody works with installation. Y'all have been working with installation, which is good. Then one of the other items from a James City County standpoint that brought this to having let somebody go, maybe we need a joint land use study, of course, is some property that's located north of the third port, which is the BASF property, and that application coming in. You look at land uses in that area, and we did through the compatibility analysis, that area is mostly industrial. And industrial land uses are consistent with the operation of the military. It's consistent with what Fort Eustis is doing in that area. And, with the flight, with noise, it is consistent with not, bringing large amounts of congregated people in there, having resort type uses in there, having residential in there. Industrial remains very much compatible and consistent with the mission. But when you look at it long term, and when we look at your future land use, shows industrial, of course, but we look at items to be able to plug it in where, say, if that area was rezoned to residential or some other use that is more transient, bringing higher concentration of people in there, that would create a problem. And that whole area through there would, and it would create a problem also in Newport News. I mean, it's not just a James City County issue. It also occurs all the way around as you go through the installation, even in the Newport News side too. And one of the things that we looked at was, long term, how do you address some of that? And some of the recommendations that came to the table was communication and coordination is the first one. And I know that y'all do communicate. I know you communicated on that application that came in with Fort Eustis. And what we want to do is see it established and clearly be established and, set the process up. And one of the things that we do, and we work with a lot of local governments on, is about put that process in place. And communication, coordination, putting those mechanisms in place that provides that coordination, not only with the county, but also with Fort Eustis, so it brings them to the table and be able to formalize that. And that is one of the recommendations. Then it's an important recommendation. And it doesn't only occur to James City County, naturally it occurs to York County and with the city of Newport News also. And then another important recommendation is education. And education goes a long way because there's a lot of people, just boating activity that occurs on the James River. A lot of people don't know or understand the mission of the installation. One of the things we do through implementation is work with the entities, and it's everybody. It's Newport News, it's James City County, and it's Fort Eustis, be able to formalize brochures, be able to formalize handout materials that you can give boaters, so they know not to go up into the third port, or they know, what's going on. Some of the training activities that do go on in that area, and it provides, just an educational mechanism to be able to inform people. We also put placards at boat ramps to inform them. Other areas in that Fort Eustis, that boundary that Fort Eustis actually has, because they have so much waterway shoreline, they do have people that enter the installation not even knowing it. They'll boat up or kayak right up to the installation and get off on the installation. So much that they have to patrol the installation now to try to monitor that. So it is important. And then also the training areas, identifying the training areas and some of those brochures and some of that information. And this also could be posted on websites. It's stuff that it kind of seems pretty basic, but it works. And we've seen it work in a lot of places, to be able to get the word out and kind of inform people what's going on in those areas. And then also, and it doesn't apply so much to James City County based on your area that you have up there, but Newport News, noise. I mean, noise is an important issue for them, to educate that community on the noise. And when houses change hands, just be able to inform the new residential owners what that area is and what that noise is and why it's important. And then it goes back down to really policy. Policy-based recommendations would actually be established in a military overlay district, and this would go into your comprehensive plan, be established there, and then really implemented through your zoning. And it'd be an overlay district that would occur and have actual regulations in there. And it would encompass kind of that area that I showed, the dash line. And one of the things that we do through the implementation, and it would be James City County working with Fort Eustis to do this, is to establish what that actual boundary is for the overlay district. And the overlay district could be, typically contain multiple layers. Some of it could be land use controls, be able to control the existing land uses, keeping it industrial. Others could be controlling height. With the flight patterns through there, you do want to regulate height and coordinate that height, any cell towers, any large communication towers, and the flight paths back with Fort Eustis. And then also just bringing them to the table and development in that area, just keeping them, and I know you already do that, you already coordinate with them, but it's really setting that process into place. And also, renewable energy. And one of the things, we've been seeing as alternative energies, as the technology gets better, we are seeing more impacts. And of course, wind turbines, and this would be large scale, not individual solar panels or wind turbines for single family residential uses. It's large term. It's large commercial farms. And there's not so much in the study area. There's not really, other than up in that industrial park area, could you have any land to actually have anything significant enough to do it, to have a wind turbine that would be a significant area to be an impact. And what it does, it actually impacts the radar. Impacts not only flight, but also the radar for the installation itself. And then dark sky requirements. And James City County already has requirements in place for dark skies, which is good. I mean, it's been proactive. It's one of the things that, we have recommended that the other jurisdictions look at some of the items that y'all have put in place, and not, having, be able to direct lights down and not having, cutoff lights. We're not having lights don't shut up in there. And it actually makes a big difference in their, especially with the helicopter flight pattern, training patterns that they use at night. And then also studies. And one of the things that comes out of joint land use studies is areas that we see that is necessary to be able to look at additional studies. And some of the recommendations are be able to look at whether capital improvements plans, whether they will impact the local governments, or whether the local governments will, the capital improvement plan will impact the installation, and vice versa. The installation also does improvements that's out in the community, or not in the community, but on the installation that impacts the community. And what we want to do is be able to set those in place where you work together. Once your capital improvement schedule's done every year, is to work with Fort Eustis on some of the items, if there's anything nearby inside really the military influence overlay area. And then also identifying, as I mentioned, that study area. And working out for the flight paths, working out what exactly needs to be done, and that will be done by coordinating that directly with Fort Eustis. And then lastly, the implementation plan. The joint land use study actually contains an implementation plan that is for the implementation of each entity: James City County, York County, and Newport News, and it lays out the process that you could follow to implement the recommendations in here. And again, these are draft recommendations. What we do encourage you to do is, after this study is done and adopted, is to look at ways, go back through and look at the recommendations that you want to move forward on the beginning and move forward with them. And OEA does fund the implementation parts too, and the additional studies that go with the implementation, because they do want you to see you implement it, because the study is only just a study if it's not moved forward and implemented.
Madam Chairman, I served on the policy committee for the study, and just wanted to compliment the consultant and staff for all the good work that was done to pull this together. Obviously, this is a set of recommendations. It's nothing that's basically saying you must do this, so forth. But I think that there was a clear indication that they were interested in gathering as much public opinion as possible, recognizing all the potential impacts that could happen, and appreciated the fact that they were so attentive to the details in putting this report together. I think there are some good opportunities for us, and I think we really do need to think about as we roll toward the next update of the comprehensive plan, adding language about a military impact overlay district, and we also may have some opportunities to do some things. You may recall that with the BASF property, there's a portion that's closest to Skips Creek that is really not subject to very intensive development. There may be some opportunities there to talk to the Defense Department about the possibility of acquiring a conservation easement on that land, so that the fort can be protected, because they are doing a lot of activities in the Skips Creek area, and that would really benefit us, I think, as well, knowing that land would then be a buffer that we wouldn't have to worry about running into compatibility issues. So thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you. And we had 8 people on the policy committee, and 2 from James City County. And then on the technical working group, we had 21, and 3, these 3 right here, from James City County. And every meeting we had, James City County was always there. And I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Porter?
If nobody has any questions, I'd like to ask a couple of questions.
Sure.
What would be the relationship between this plan and, say, BRAC in looking at?
Sure. You know, one of the things, and if you, the Office of Economic Adjustment through Department of Defense funds these joint land use studies. And if you ask them that question, they say nothing. There is no relationship. But I have talked to people who have served on previous BRAC committees, and they tell me that's part of the checklist, whether or not a local government and the installation has done a joint land use study. Because it's important. It shows that communication, that coordination, and that they're working to resolve, future impacts. And that's one of the things that the BRAC committee does look at. So it does help the installation on BRAC.
And my second question is, as a region, we were asked to take our position against offshore drilling because there's some kind of a safety circle, something around those in the water that the Navy has to stay away from. Is that kind of thing going to impact with the power line that's going across the James?
No, and the power line was brought into this study, and it's actually shown in there in one of the maps. And then, of course, Fort Eustis has noted that it did not impact them. That it wasn't an issue.
On the power line issue, that was an issue that was raised, but I think the Defense Department was sort of torn between the question of whether they believe the need for power overrode the other concerns, and they didn't find that it interfered with the flight activities in the net.
It usually doesn't interfere until somebody hits them.
Yeah, well, they've got
Parenthetically, mention that we just heard today that the National Parks Conservation Association has filed an intent to file suit against the Army Corps and
because of the
because of the failure to follow the procedures of the Endangered Species Act on the power line. So we're waiting for another court decision to come down sometime probably before the end of the month. But that's a new one that will impact the decisions.
But the flight path area we looked at, I think the power lines are just a little further outside that.
They are
north.
Yeah.
They adjusted those as it kind of made that kick because it was in the flight path.
That's right.
And that's why I pushed it down further towards us.
Any other questions? Okay. All right.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Is there any further discussion either group wants to have about this particular conversation, or are we good to move on? All right. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Paul Holt, who is going to introduce our agenda item number 2. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board, and members of the commission. At the February 27th work session of the board discussed various decision points as it relates to developing possible ordinance amendments for items that were formally proffered, that were formally addressed through proffers. The board provided staff and the policy committee chair with input and a sense of direction, and the board also expressed a desire to have input into the next level down of the details of some of those items. Policy committee has continued its work, so we're back here today with those details and those next set of options for your consideration and discussion. If you're generally still okay with the previous format that we used, I'll continue today by covering a brief synopsis of each of the items and the options, and then followed up by the chair of the policy committee, Mr. Haldeman, to express the policy committee's summaries and recommendations. So first up, we have the traffic impact analysis submittal requirement policy. As you may recall, the traffic impact analysis submittal requirement policy, it's a mouthful, was adopted on June 12, 2012 by the board and was designed to provide guidance to applicants regarding the minimum content requirements for traffic studies. At the February 27th board work session, the board chose option 3, which was outlined in that February 27th staff report, which essentially was to draft and add an adequate transportation facilities test to the traffic impact analysis policy that would function similar to the board's adopted adequate public facilities test for schools. The test would give guidance on how to handle situations where off-site traffic impacts are able to be mitigated and where they could not be. As included in your agenda packets, the draft adequacy test proposes that a rezoning or SUP application will pass the test if either one, no off-site improvements are required by the approved traffic study, or two, any off-site required improvements would be guaranteed in a form that could be approved by the county attorney. If the approved traffic study recommends off-site improvements or indicates deficiencies which could not be mitigated or guaranteed, then the application would not pass the adequate transportation facilities test policy, and the Planning Commission and the board could take that into consideration when considering legislative applications. So as we've identified in the staff report, at this point in the policy committee's work, there are two options for moving forward. Option one would be to accept the draft adequate transportation facilities test and ordinance revisions. Got to come up with a shorter name. Yeah. As recommended by the policy committee, that language was included as an attachment to the staff report. Staff would then finalize this item and schedule this item to move forward in the public hearing process. Or option two, should the board have additional feedback and or requests for changes, if you could provide that direction to the policy committee, staff would then continue to work with that group on further revisions, and we would bring that back for the board's consideration. Mr. Haldeman?
I think you pretty much covered it. We'd be interested in hearing any feedback the board has on the policy recommendation, the policy committee's recommendation that we move forward on the adequate transportation test.
I'm working off of this sheet.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. On the second page, with the bullet points, and that first group of bullet points, number 4, I guess, analysis of future conditions without development, and then 2 below that is analysis of future conditions with development.
Right. And
when you say development, are you referring just to the particular project that's under consideration?
Correct.
Okay, so when you're doing the projected analysis, is that taking into account other approved development since in the last evaluation of the situation, or is only looking at the impact of the conditions prior to this going in and the conditions assuming this goes in?
It's a general analysis. They do not do the traffic engineers do not do a cumulative roll-up. And so if you're looking at a particular site, you're not going to pull, 3 months ago there was 20,000 approved here, and 6 months ago there were 14 units. It all goes into a background traffic calculation that the traffic engineers arrive at working with VDOT. So that development, that approved development, when they look at the land uses on the corridor in general, and when they look at previous traffic growth, and they look at the Hampton Roads TPO's long-range model from 2040, there are a bunch of assumptions in there that take all that into account and come up with an annual percentage growth, 1%, 2%, 3%, and it all factors into that.
So then that brings me to the front side of that same sheet, where we have exceptions, and it provides for an exception where a TIA does not need to be updated if TIA or 527 TIAs that send kids to college on the road was previously submitted for a rezoning or a special use permit, and all assumptions made in the TIA remain valid. So I guess my question would be, how do we know whether the assumptions are valid or not? Are they taking into account this? I think we sort of ran into this issue with a proposal not long ago on Centerville Road.
It was. I think it might have been the Summer Place. Where just not a lot of current development had occurred in the intervening years, and when we looked back at the assumptions, it did not appear that there were any material changes at that time that would affect any of the conclusions. So it's pretty rare. That was a rural enough area where not much had occurred since that traffic study was last done. It happens pretty infrequently.
Yeah, but it does trouble me that we would have an extended period of time, because it's not just the development that may necessarily have been approved right along that road. It could be other confounding factors that may be changing traffic patterns or resulting in some differences. So I guess I'd look for some possibility of a more cautious approach to exemptions, exceptions to the requirement of the studies.
Does this include what's been approved or what's possibly able to be moved forward? Maybe that development doesn't happen this year, but is that calculated into the next development that's coming on board as far as a traffic study?
I think that's why they boil it down to an annual percentage, because you're right, all of that's market-based. They don't really know. There are no real guarantees about when, even if a particular development will even receive legislative approval or administrative approval, or when that would be, or when the market decides to actually move forward with construction and then occupy those units. It's just too many variables and too many factors. So I think that's where they just simplistically try to get to a background.
But if we take,
I'm sorry.
If we take Deer Lake, there's 50 lots there.
Yeah.
2 cars a lot. That's 100 lots, 100 cars travel, in a day. Is that calculated into, that was my biggest worry with Summer House Place was, okay, we've got this development. We know we're dumping probably 80 cars, not total 100, but maybe 80. We cut it down, cut 20% off that travel. So we've got 80 there plus this development. Will that be calculated in, even though it's not built, if this starts to build and then this starts right behind it, now all of a sudden we have a couple hundred cars that we hadn't calculated for, because we know roughly per house we're going to have 2 cars. Even if we put half of them out there.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
Every 4 years, the HRTPO does their long-range transportation plan and runs models associated with that. And we have to submit to them our existing and projected land uses. And so we would update, any changes related to recent developments to them. In addition, they make some assumptions for the entire region as to what our growth will be over the next 20 years or so. And we have to allocate the traffic growth to each of the individual transportation analysis zones, as Paul mentioned. And they're smaller than census blocks, but we take those into account, the different developments that have been approved, how close they are to being constructed, and we try to absorb that information into the model. And then that model is used by the traffic consultants in doing the impact analyses.
Which is why during LRTP update, there are so many times that the TPO staff comes back to that regional body is to approve the assumptions, then to approve the allocations, then to approve Mr. Grutendorf's growth projections, and they kind of keep checking in, because that's the outcome. That's how all of that data lives, is because there's an assumption where all this traffic's going to come from. So our county is divided up into how many TAZs?
At least 20.
Dozens of, census tracts. And knowing what we know at the staff level based on what the board has approved and what we know is in our comprehensive plan, we assign a projected value of growth in each of those zones. They bubble all of that up into the regional transportation model and run their magic on their supercomputers down there, figure out where all the traffic's going to go and come from and impacts to arterials. And as Tammy mentioned, when the traffic engineers come in and do their analysis, that's then how the Deer Lakes of the world get picked up. So again, it's not a one-for-one relationship because the model applies to the whole region.
But I'm thinking more of, and I understand that concept and how they're putting that together. And also there's a section where so much is dropped off because that development may not be done in 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
If that development then is completed in a 5-year period, then we're behind the 8 ball. And what I'm looking at as far as, I look at what we have on the shelf we have Deer Lake, not picking on Deer Lake, we have Deer Lake with 50 lots. Okay, we know that traffic's coming on Jolly Pond, which is originally wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to go through the neighborhood. So that was never to come out on Jolly Pond. So we know we have 50 lots there coming out on Jolly Pond. The next thing that we develop any further, we have to take that 50 and add to that 50. Not, well, possibly in 5 years or 10 years, because if we don't calculate that now, even though it's not there, when it does come on board, that's when we get to traffic jams. That's when we get to frustration from the citizens. How didn't you know that? Why didn't you plan for this? Why didn't you, and of course, I understand what y'all are doing, but I'm thinking of kind of how do we box that in as far as, we already know we have 50. If we add this one, now we may have 200. And we need to, make sure the citizens know it, because I know with the TPO and all their planning is basically, I need to build X amount of roads and plan for the X amount of roads. They're not as concerned of James City County as I am with, I've got X amount already coming on my roads. I've got X amount that are going to be coming on my roads. And it's good for both boards to know, that within this area, you've got this much approved. If you add that, you're not just adding 50 cars. When all this is built out, you may be adding 200 cars.
Yeah.
And that changes the whole thought process, especially for the citizens, because they get frustrated with traffic.
So there are a couple of other things, again, based on the wisdom of the Planning Commission and Board that also get regularly put into place, for each of the comprehensive plan updates, especially with the last one. There's always a more granular look at James City County. There's a more granular look at the historic triangle. This last comprehensive plan update, we had done a coordinated traffic study for the historic triangle that really got down into a whole lot more detail in terms of levels of service on our principal roadways. We also leverage the most recent VDOT traffic counts that come in the door. You'll remember, and then all of that sort of combined up into the individual legislative applications. The comprehensive plan also tries to wrap everything up with the goals, strategies, and action items. And you'll remember there's a set of projected needed roadway improvements in one of the appendices that we've been using as a checklist to go get done to ensure that our roads are proactively planned, not only in coordination with the land use, but also for future widening. So, that's where you're getting the Croker roads coming from. That's where you're getting the Long Hill roads coming from, the Skiffs Creek connectors. It sort of reads as, again, staff takes it as a to-do list, right, to go out and find the money to build all these things. For this next comprehensive plan update, staff has also been able to leverage some non-local funding, some state funding, to do a even more in-depth, comprehensive master transportation plan, which will do even more to integrate transportation with land use, right? You can't do transportation after you decide land use. They have to be done together. So we're going to have again, thanks to the state, we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to really get down, really look at our activity centers, look at the areas where there's more density, look at the areas where the growth is occurring, look at those areas that we want to keep more rural and rustic, tie all that together with that coordinated transportation plan on how to move people around, balance the tourism with the industrial piece, with the residential growth, and again, really integrate that with all the land use. So I think that's an exciting thing to come. And, again, we talked about in the strategic plan, the idea of trying to better define what the costs of growth were in some of these updated fiscal impact analyses. That's something that was part of the included as part of the budget. Really want to try to explore what some of the current leading thoughts are and trying to capture what those transportation costs are as a component of new growth. So, I think we've done a really good job over the years. I think there's even more exciting stuff to come here in the next few years and some neat opportunities.
Yeah, I don't want to give any that I would criticize your ability to analyze the traffic flows and so forth. What gives me a little bit of concern is the idea that we would be exempting from a traffic impact analysis a situation where a previous analysis had been done maybe a decade or more ago. And I think that's what we experienced with the Summer Place, where they were supposed to have done analysis every 5 years and hadn't. And I recognize there hadn't been a lot of development along that roadway, but I just don't really think that gives me a lot of comfort that I really understand the impact it might be having. Maybe we haven't picked up because of things like actual development right along that same roadway, as opposed to things that might still be impacting the traffic patterns and development.
The policies before both bodies, and certainly if there's a consensus of the board to put an upper limit on that, say every 5 years or what have you, I think that's something that.
Well, that's really the reason that I raised it, because
Sure.
You'd ask for feedback on things that might be worth considering for inclusion, and I think that's something that I put on the table as worth considering.
I would agree.
Would that be something where if we could amend it to maybe put that limitation of 5 years or something in it? Or would that be?
I think the point would be that you all will go back and take a look at this and bring it to the Planning Commission for discussion, and then if there's a consensus that that's a good thing to do, then just amend the rest of it. I haven't really seen anything specific in here that I would point to as other concerns about that document.
Okay. Yep, yeah.
Great. Is there some general consensus then for, with that caveat in mind, for either option one with that caveat, or are there other items that?
I think option one with that caveat.
Okay.
That basically that you would have a chance to work it and bring it up to the system.
Definitely do that. Okay. Great. With that, we'll move on to the next topic. One of the attachments, that was included in your agenda packet, I am going to hand out one paper copy of, just because I think it will be a little bit more succinct in terms of having something in front of you. With the archaeological policy and the natural resources policy, the February 27th meeting, the board chose option 4, again, which was outlined in the February 27th staff report for these items, and that was to add the requirement to complete and submit a Phase 1 archaeological study or an initial species inventory in respect to natural heritage as a submittal requirement for site plans and major subdivisions. In addition, it would add language to the special regulations or the other appropriate sections of the ordinance to require further study or management plans prior to the issuance of land disturbing permits, and if recommended by that Phase 1 study or the initial inventory required. For these items, the board indicated a desire to better understand which projects would be exempt from these requirements. In your agenda packets is the full draft language of the ordinances as currently under development by the policy committee. But again, for quick reference, we've just printed out here attachment number 5, which is just a matrix of the exemption and waiver criteria. On one side is the criteria and exemptions for site plans, and on the back side is the exemption and waiver criteria for subdivisions. In short, as proposed, minor subdivisions, boundary line adjustments, and family subdivisions would all be exempt, minor subdivisions being fewer than 5 lots. Minor additions in those commercial projects that do not require site plans and that do not require land disturbing permits would be exempt. Work on land that has already been disturbed or has been covered by previously approved and implemented studies are exempt. Single-family homes and temporary structures are exempt. As a potential catch-all, an applicant would also have the option of requesting a waiver from the planning director, and should a difference of opinion form, Those requests could then be considered by the Development Review Committee. This form and format preserves the consistency of other such considerations that already exist in the county code and continues the paradigm of using the DRC as an appellate body. So again, as we've identified in the staff report, there are two options before the board today. First one would be to accept the proposed ordinance language, including the waiver and exemption criteria. Again, staff could then finalize these items and schedule the public hearings. Option two would be to provide the policy committee with additional feedback or requests for changes, and again, staff would continue to proceed to work with them on those additional items. Mr. Haldeman.
It's the policy committee's recommendation to accept option number one. And so we welcome any feedback on that or board acceptance.
So I'll say that I think I'm fine with this. There's just two questions or two items I wanted to just raise real quickly. And one is this does provide an exception in a case where land has previously been disturbed. So I could imagine a situation where somebody had planned to build a home or some home sites and so forth. Land was disturbed, but then over a period of maybe a decade or so, an endangered species had taken up residence in either a plant or animal in that disturbed area. Are we covered on that?
For the new the new flowers that grow into
right.
those spaces.
Right. The world begonias of the world. The world begonia.
That's it. I guess to your point, it's good we're having this discussion. So there is not as proposed. These are just strictly listed out as proposed exemption waiver criteria. So there's
right.
not, well, if you're exempt, but there's another way to still requirement. There's not that piece in there. So in your instance, in your example, let's say if there's land disturbance on the project that's less than 2,500 square feet, and an application walks in that requires that, that would trigger that piece. That exemption. There's not a way to put that requirement back on there as currently proposed.
Right. So I guess that's a question.
Yeah.
Is that work? I mean,
Does this am I correct if I read that single family lots? And I've built some of where a single family lot is a flag lot.
Right.
And 2,500 square feet is in driveway with still more room to go. So then that would trigger.
So if that's part of a minor subdivision or a boundary line adjustment, then no. And a single family home doesn't trigger the need for a site plan under the zoning ordinance, so that
Right.
wouldn't trigger.
Okay, I was just making sure we were still.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at the under site plans, D. So the project area has been previously disturbed as evidenced by existing site features, historic photography, or other documentation deemed sufficient by the director of planning.
So it's an interesting analogy. I mean, think back to what we just did for transportation. We were, Ellen had a really good idea. We could add an upper limit, let's say, within the last 5 years.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The possibility that something would grow back in such a short period of time would be fairly remote. So that could certainly be an easy way to accomplish and to close that potential loophole, as you say.
Yeah. So if you all can think about it and tell us what you think it makes any sense. That'd be great. The other thing is because I'm still in the outer fringes of the zone of Sam reading and correcting. Under C, on the subdivisions part, on both sides, on both the archaeology and the natural resources inventory, you just take out the first A, Article A.
Yes.
It got an A.
I didn't say I got an A.
So, and we had a resident archaeologist, so we were covered on that.
Felt very comfortable.
These edits are elsewhere.
He would have uncovered it.
I'm sure.
Any other comments on that? Okay.
Those were the hard ones. And one left. Oh, thank you. So, again, there were two options. Is it staff's takeaway that, again, with that caveat, there's consensus from the board to move forward in this direction and wrap these items up?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's right. Okay, lastly, item C, which is the pedestrian and bicycle accommodations. At the February 27th work session, the board chose option 2, which was to amend the zoning and subdivision ordinances, which currently require new developments to adhere to the pedestrian accommodations master plan, to also include requirements to adhere to the bikeways plan. The ordinance language would apply to residential projects, including major subdivisions, and for multifamily and apartment developments. This one's returning to the board because on April 12th, the policy committee, while reviewing draft ordinance language, requested an additional provision to add a requirement for bicycle connections between new residential developments and adjoining schools, parks, or recreation facilities. Policy committee also reviewed additional language that in the exemption section of the ordinance would be formatted and updated to more clearly parallel and mimic and include some of the same language that we just talked about for the archaeology and natural resources to ensure that was all consistent. At the April 12th Policy Committee, the committee also discussed adding in by reference minimum standards and construction specifications for both sidewalks and bicycle connections, and those references were clarified by the Policy Committee at their meeting on May 10th. So again, much like the others, there are two options currently before the board. Option 1 would be to accept the proposed ordinance language to include a recommendation that both pedestrian and bicycle connections be provided between residential developments and adjoining facilities, and to include the updated exemption criteria and the new minimum design standards. And staff could then finalize those items and get those scheduled for public hearings. And option 2 would again be, should the board have any additional feedback or requests for changes, staff would work with the policy committee on those items. Mr. Haldeman.
Again, the policy committee recommends option number 1. We've completed our work on it so far. Certainly welcome any feedback.
Just for a touch of detail, again, the language as decided by the policy committee would be that publicly maintained accommodations would meet VDOT standards, and for privately maintained accommodations, VDOT construction standards would apply for sidewalks, because, again, inherent in those, it would meet Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Parks and Recreation Greenways Master Plan standards would apply to the multi-use paths.
I think it's good to connect where we can connect and keep more bikes off the roads that don't have a bike lane. I think we're going to eventually have to address that. I'm scared somebody's going to be hit on one of these back roads. They've had a few accidents. I was going down Jelly Pond today, and the school bus was in front of me, and there was a biker in front of the school bus, and we were traveling between 10 and 12 miles an hour all the way from Centerville all the way up to the school, and which is good. The school bus driver did exactly what they should. They weren't going to take a chance going around a bike and then being in another lane. But I think the more we add bike trails and bike paths and that sort of thing, the more we ought to look at probably encouraging our bikers, which I'm all for, to utilize those and not our back roads where, you know, they're at risk. I mean, you go around a corner and a bike's right there. It's hard to stop a dump truck when you've got a bicycle in the middle of the road. So we're going to have to, as we move down this path, not today, but we're going to have to address some of that with the bikes and try to convince them we build a beautiful bike trail on Route 5 And I'd like to see more activity there than our back roads, just for safety. I don't want to see anybody get hurt. You know, that would be a terrible thing. But I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, we like this as well.
Is there consensus that we should move forward with the language as proposed, and we'll get it scheduled for
Believe
public
so.
hearing? Thanks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
That concludes our ordinance piece.
Okay. With that, I believe that brings us to the Pocahontas Trail Corridor Study, and Tammy Rosario is going to do that. And you're going to introduce a consultant?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Commission and Board. For the past 10 months, the Planning Commission, the Planning Division, VDOT, and its consultant RK&K have been engaging with the Grove community and the larger community to reassess the transportation needs, desired improvements, and priorities for the Pocahontas Trail Corridor. This effort would not have been possible without the support of the Technical Committee and the Steering Committee, and Mr. Schmidt has been the Planning Commission representative on the Steering Committee. In January, staff and Jeff Kudish of RK&K updated the Policy Committee and the Board on the first phase of the study, a review of the existing conditions and needs of the corridor. Today, Jeff will update the Planning Commission and the Board on the significant work that has occurred since January, namely on the second and third phases, concept development and alternative refinement and prioritization. In anticipation of submitting funding applications this summer, staff has placed final consideration of the corridor study on the Commission's June 6th agenda and the Board's July 10th agenda. With that, I'll turn things over to Jeff from RK&K.
Thanks a lot, Tammy. Really glad to have the opportunity to be here and present an update on the study as we are sort of moving towards the finish line from this study phase and prepared to present some recommendations to you for your consideration. I do want to recognize Mr. McCormick is here from our steering committee. He was very instrumental in the process, just one of many members on that group, but he did come today to listen in, so we appreciate him continuing his support for the process. It's really a great project with a lot of community engagement, which I think was really key part of where we wanted to go with this, is really make sure the community was supportive of the recommendations and the alternatives put forward for the Pocahontas Trail Corridor. A lot of slides. I'm not going to go through all of them today. Just wanted that information there. So if you wanted more detail, I'd be glad to answer questions. But we're taking a look at Route 60, essentially starting at the fire station number 2, just east of Busch Gardens, and extending down to the area of the James River Elementary School, down and continuing east of that towards Greenmount Industrial Park. So members, we did have a technical advisory committee with fire and rescue, schools, parks and recreation, all providing some good technical input, including VDOT, and then our steering committee, which was made up of local residents and business owners that provided a lot of great representation from the group. They also were just completely invaluable in reaching out to the community and getting folks coming to our meetings, so we had great turnout at our larger public workshops. Again, as Tammy mentioned, we're sort of wrapping up in the alternative refinement and prioritization phase. So the concepts that we wound up presenting to the community, we did the first phase was listening. What are your issues? What are the issues out here that the community felt? And then what we saw as part of our engineering investigations. And we developed 3 concepts that we presented to the community. Part of that we also updated them with was what those potential improvements may cost. So there's sort of 4 key elements to those cost estimates. So these are complete project cost estimates that we put together for each alternative. The first option that we presented to the community was a 3-lane option with a shared use path on one side of the road and a sidewalk on the other side of the road. This option essentially provides 1 travel lane per direction, with the center lane being a left turn lane for a 2-way left turn lane for travel in both directions. When we look at the corridor today, about 50% of the corridor already is 3 lanes in this study area with existing turn lanes through the corridor. So this really connects those from the roadway standpoint, and then it fills in those gaps in the pedestrian network that exists out today and provides a facility with a shared use path intended for use by bicycles and pedestrians. Total cost for this option is around $28 million. That's all in current year dollars. So, as we move ahead, inflation and all that will will apply, but these are all in current year dollars just to keep the comparison set. One thing to recognize as well, that initial $28 million, that does not include undergrounding of the utilities, the overhead power and communication lines. That's an additional $5 to $6 million to add that component to the project. But that was something that we heard very strongly from the community was part of their vision for the corridor, was doing it right, to come out here in one go. Second option that we looked at was a variation of the first option. It maintained the 3-lane section for roadway for vehicular traffic, but rather than using the shared use path to accommodate cyclists, this included on-road bicycle lanes. This has a higher cost, primarily because of the additional pavement to put, putting a wider roadway out there to include those bicycle lanes in each direction. This is approximately $31 million than before the added cost for the undergrounding. Both option 1 and option 2, we really thought from the technical side were sufficient to accommodate the traffic that's out there currently and future traffic growth on the corridor. Current traffic counts around 10,000 vehicles a day. This does fluctuate on the corridor depending on if there's an incident on I-64, that all bets are off on the amount of traffic. But on a typical day-to-day basis, this is certainly sufficient to accommodate. This type of configuration could accommodate around 18 to 20,000 vehicles a day. So sort of the typical daily traffic volumes could double, and you'd still be able to accommodate the traffic on the corridor. The third option that we presented, because there was some concern with the overall vehicular congestion and growth from the community, we looked at a 5-lane option. It's 2 lanes per direction with a 2-way left turn lane. We had the shared use path configuration to accommodate the cyclists and then a sidewalk on the other side of the road. So total cost of approximately $41 million before adding in the overhead utility relocations. You can see from a roadway capacity standpoint, a lot more roadway capacity here, almost 40,000 vehicles a day. But at the end of this segment, you'd then still be transitioning back to what is essentially a 2-lane road. So if you provide a lot more capacity here, it's not necessarily increasing the capacity of the entire stretch of Route 60 that you would need to if you were going with this type of option. The 3-lane option really sort of would tie back more seamlessly to what occurs east of here. So what's important in this process is what the community felt about those 3 options. We presented the options at our January 24th public workshop. We had about 50 folks in attendance that night, really great turnout at Little Zion Baptist Church right there on the corridor. And about 45 of those participated in a sort of question and answer session that we had. We presented them some information and we did a show of hands to see what the community was feeling. We then followed up on the project website with a web survey that duplicated a lot of those questions. So folks, if they could not attend the meeting, they had the opportunity to respond via the web survey. About 75 to 80% of the respondents that we had preferred one of those 3-lane options that we presented, with nearly half of all the responses preferring the first option with the 3 lanes with the shared use path. A lot of themes that we heard from the community. They, separating the cyclists and the vehicular traffic, lighting along the corridor, more locations where they could cross the road was very important. And we really tried to integrate those features into the improvement concepts as we moved forward. So we took that feedback from the community and we started to focus in on that first option, the lowest of the cost of the 3, but it was the one that also had the most community support. I'm going to skip over this one. And they're currently on the project, if you're starting to look at funding availability, there's $3 million currently on the project with some CMAQ funding, which is provided through the TPO. Paul and Tammy, I think, were successful recently. That's pending formal action in May.
It's official. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll get it.
Awesome. So another additional $1.5 million that could be dedicated to improvements in this section of Pocahontas Trail. And then, there's some funding I've proposed in the CIP that could be used also maybe as a match to other VDOT funding or some different funding programs. So while we certainly are absolutely supportive and encouraging pursuing funding for the entire set of improvements, This is a large dollar project, so looking at perhaps separating the corridor into some smaller segments that may better match the size of the available funding is something that we wanted to really talk about with the community and pursue. And thinking, $5 to $8 to $10 million, those size projects may work a little better in the current funding environment we've got with VDOT. So we really just laid out an approach for the community. Step one is trying to find some low-hanging fruit. Are there improvements that could be done sooner rather than later, that could be done within the existing right-of-way, and that would work with the future improvements? So you wouldn't put something in and construct something that then would have to be modified substantially when the full project came down. So there are a couple of bus pull-off locations on the corridor. The first one near Grove Christian Outreach. We've had some preliminary discussions with WADA about them as a site where they think there's a lot of potential there. They have some dedicated transit shelter and bus stop improvement funds they may be able to utilize. So we're trying to identify those opportunities so the community starts to see some momentum and some things happening. Then the next piece was really breaking the overall corridor into segments. The main thing here was we do need to have some logical start and end points. That's a federal requirement. If there's any federal funding on the project, we can't sort of arbitrarily just slice it into segments that fit the amount of money we have. We need to find really logical starting and ending points between intersections or areas where there's clear needs defined. So what we wound up doing is really broke the corridor into 6 segments. They're sort of labeled A, B, C, D, and then we had 5 originally, which was segment E. And on some discussions with VDOT and with some other folks, we separated E into 2 separate pieces, E1 and E2. And the map, that's the slide you also have in front of you, because I think that'll help when we move on to a couple of the next slides. You can sort of refer back to which was segment A again, which was segment B again. So segment A starts at the fire station, continues over to Howard Drive. That's about a 0.4 mile stretch. It's the lowest cost section at $5 million for sort of on a per mile basis. There's less utilities in this section. There's a little less work to be done in that particular piece. Segment B picked up at Howard Drive, extended down to Jackson Street. It's another approximately a little under a half a mile, $7.6 million. Segment C we broke out separately, but our intent with C, it's a very short segment, a little under 0.2 of a mile, was really to use that as a piece we could either attach to an adjacent segment depending on funding availability. It may make more sense to do C with D or C with B, but you would not, in all likelihood, do C as an independent piece. E1 or D picks up at Magruder Avenue, which is right there at Colonial Manor at the Senior Center, extends over to Ron Springs Drive, which is just west of the 7-Eleven. It's a 0.3 mile segment, $5 million. This was the area where there's actually the only segment of the corridor where there's a gap in the sidewalk system. We do have sidewalk on the one side of the road continuously through the corridor. It's not all in great or perfect condition, but there is a off-street pedestrian path. In this area, there's actually about 800 feet where the sidewalk is there's no sidewalk present, and there's really just deep ditches on the side of the road. So people are physically walking in the street primarily in this segment. E1 is another shorter piece from Ron Springs Drive, just past the 7-Eleven, $2.7 million, and then E2 picks up at 7-Eleven and goes to the end of the corridor. For planning purposes, we heard a lot of information and feedback from the community to do a potential, what if you wanted to carry this a little further east to pick up Windy Hill and some of the remaining pieces of residential in this area. So that's another approximately half a mile. We put a real high-level planning look at that. That's probably another $6 to $8 million if you wanted to eventually start thinking about, does it make sense to take this a little further east than where our detailed study area was. So then we thought about, all right, we have these 6 segments. Well, if you're going to do this, you potentially do this and prioritize these and do this in phases, where are the needs the highest? This chart was really something we put together, red being the areas with the highest needs, orange being sort of the next, and then yellow and green and so on. And what we really honed in on was that segment D, which was, again, that stretch between Magruder Avenue and Ron Springs Drive, where we had substantial pedestrian concerns because of the lack of sidewalk. The roadway is very narrow. You can't physically pull off the road if you have an issue. this is an area that causes issues for the emergency responders to move up and down the corridor because there's nowhere for cars to get out of their way if there is an incident. Obviously, traffic safety, the roadside drainage is particularly a concern here with those deep ditches. So that area really popped out as sort of a top priority from everything we had looked at. So we developed a preliminary set of recommendations for phasing these. The order shown here, grouping segments C and D. Segment B was our initial thought as the second highest priority because that was also a narrow section of road, followed by segments E1 and E2, and then segment A having the lowest needs as perhaps being the last priority. But what we did then was present that information to the public at another workshop at the end of April. We really wanted to get their feedback on, is this how they would prioritize it? Do they see the needs the same way that we on the study team did? So in this we actually asked them, we had a presentation, we provided them, we had maps, they could discuss with us one-on-one and answer any questions, and then we had them actually sort of rank these groupings of segments with their priority order. And what we found was that the community agreed that this combination of that segment C and D was really, their top priority as well. When it got to the second and third priority, we got a little bit different feedback than we had looked at. They were leaning a little bit more towards segments E, picking up at Ron Springs Drive in the eastern end of the corridor as their second priority relative to priority number 3, or segment B. So we went back, we had a meeting with our technical and our steering committee. A couple more things. Definitely heard that the improvements were consistent with the community's vision. That was a key thing that we wanted to hear. There was definitely a desire for action and doing it right. Again, if there are some options potentially to defer some elements and save some cost. But I mean, the community's thought was, if we're going to do this, construction out here, work to be done. Let's do it right, do it once, and have a nice asset to the community moving forward. We did talk with our steering committee about that change to the potential order of the recommendations and our technical committee. From what our preliminary recommendation was, we asked if we did reverse the order of segments B and E1 and E2. I think everyone was comfortable. No real objections to modifying that order. So we did revise our recommendations based on that broader community feedback. So this is our current version of the prioritization recommendations. So starting with segments C and D, then moving on to E, and then going back to the west, picking up and finishing B and A in that order. So our next steps are just to...
Can we go back that one slide?
Absolutely.
With segment 1 and 2, by putting them in that place, are we saving, was it 8 million? You've got it at 8 million there, and on here we've got 6.1 and 2.7.
Sure, you do save, if you do more segments together, that's one thing I should have mentioned. If you break out the pieces, the cost of the smaller pieces, it starts to, the sum of all those together is higher than that original total because of, you're paying multiple contractors to go out. You have some additive costs. So combining E1 and E2, yes, there is a savings there than doing them as separate pieces. So that's why that 8 is a little different. It's about $1 million to $1.5 million total for the whole corridor. Sort of added cost by segmenting it.
Right.
So yeah, great question though.
Saves 800,000.
That's cost savings there. So we're going to revise, finalizing our summary report, which will be available and presented to the Planning Commission on June 6th. And then assuming you're also supportive of the recommendations, then moving forward to try to secure funding with an application through VDOT Smart Scale program, amongst many other funding avenues that the county's planning to explore. But one other element we wanted to share with you today, this is an item that we shared at the public workshop.
This is amazing.
Second here. This was a video simulation that we created of the corridor that we wanted to demonstrate for the community. This is not sort of a final what the what the corridor would look like, but what it could look like if the types of treatments that you could do. It began really with a fly through. We sort of fly from the western end of the corridor and advance, west to east. And then at 5 or 6 locations, we drop down to street level. And so folks can see, what it looks like today and then what it could look like with the types of improvements we're talking about. So we're just going to sort of run this. And then if we want to discuss as this is running, that'd be great. But so you have the top part of the screen is the existing corridor, and then the improvements are sort of floating in over it. So you can also see, how much sort of are we talking about widening? How much wider is the roadway getting in some areas? Where does that shared use path fall in the sidewalk? The shared use path is on the left in this particular configuration, and the sidewalk is on the right side of the screen. Yes. And also, yes, the alignment, we did not just sort of pick up the middle of the road and say we're going to widen equally to both sides. We did try to lay out a roadway alignment that minimized impacts to the extent practical along the corridor. So there's some areas where we shift a little bit more to the south because there's more right-of-way, or there's fewer homes on that side. So then we shift back and you will see things meandering a little bit. This image is just what one of the potential pedestrian crossings could look like, with a refuge island there, so folks could actually cross to the middle of the street. If it wasn't clear, then they could then wait in the middle and find a gap in the opposite direction of traffic to improve safety. When you're putting in crossings on these types of facilities that are unsignalized, you want to make sure that if you can do it in 2 stages so the pedestrian can focus on one direction or the other, that's a really great way to make sure that they can cross the street safely. This is an area where you see we sort of shifted over towards the golf course driving range area because there's homes and businesses very close to the road on the one side. So we just adjusted the alignment to try to account for that. This does depict the underground utilities being undergrounded, but again, that is an additive cost to those numbers. And VDOT and Federal Highway typically do not participate in that element. That's considered a betterment. And needs to be funded.
It makes an enormous difference.
It absolutely, from a aesthetic side and just from a community reliability and their all of that. Right. So yeah, but so this is it's about 6 minutes of video. So,
if we were ready to talk about.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So everything's happening in the Roberts district.
That's nice for you, John.
It is very much so, and it's appropriate as well because so much of our industrial base and tax revenue comes from this area, and it's severely impacted by things like tourist traffic, the effect of accidents on 64, 143, and all the rest. And this is a long overdue improvement that's being proposed here. I just had a couple of quick points. I always like to refer to this as Eula Radcliffe Memorial Highway, which it is, and to recognize that there are benefits to doing this in phases, but I guess a question, I'll just go through a list of a couple of things that I'd like you to maybe respond to. One is, while I like the idea of being able to take advantage of the amounts of money that VDOT is typically doling out for projects, I guess I have a question about what kind of impact that phasing will have on the construction itself. Is it going to be, for instance, if we were able to identify funding to do undergrounding, does it make it more complicated to do the undergrounding of utilities if you're doing it in segments and so forth? A second is just to again, underline my very strong preference for a plan that takes into account undergrounding. And I hope we might be able to work with the stormwater improvements that we know are already programmed for the area and talk with our local utility about the benefits of participating with us in undergrounding utility lines. I would like to know about what happens at Plantation Drive or James River Elementary, are we going to be stuck with a bottleneck there in some way or another, or is it going to be a point at which traffic has already dispersed enough that we can get through that without too much difficulty, or do we really need to start thinking about that additional segment? And finally, I just wanted to express my appreciation to the committee that worked on this very hard. Thomas, I know, is here and put in a lot of work, as did a number of other folks. And Danny, every time I went to one of the meetings that was being held, I saw them working hard to get as much information as they could from the citizens who attended, and appreciate all the folks who turned out to this. I think it reflected both their strong interest in the project and their willingness to give up their time to work on it. So those are a couple of the questions that I have for you.
Sure, absolutely. Well, to address the first question, I mean, yeah, the phased approach, I mean, that is going to extend the duration of impacts to the community. If you came out and did this all at once as one project, I'm going to pause this at the end because I think it's going to help me answer your second question. So while I... Okay.
But does it also make it harder to coordinate that?
It certainly could. I mean, the utility component, I mean, you come out and you build this in pieces, you're going to be relocated. If you're relocating the utilities overhead, you're sort of continually having them come back out and move them. If we're going to underground them, I mean, it may be feasible because particularly if that's a sort of a separate cost item, what the feasibility of maybe that the undergrounding utilities, as long as we get them in the right place where they would need to be, to accommodate the future improvements, that I guess that could be something that could potentially be done separately. But there's a risk there that if they move them and then the final design elements on a later phase comes in, and then you don't want to have to move them again.
So we would also need to make sure that as we're doing the stormwater project, we're carefully coordinating for the plan on the road.
Right. Yes. And Daryl Cook has been on our technical advisory committee, so he's heavily engaged in the ongoing improvements. We've been sharing our sketches and our files and our drawings so they understand, the conceptual level of the improvements the design we've got at this stage, but at least can see where we're headed with our improvements. So the second question, when we get to Plantation Drive, and again, this is sort of our study ends here, just east of Plantation Drive, you sort of transition into, immediately east of there, you have a 3-lane section because there is a left turn lane centered on the road. Now you get just past, down closer to the Happy Shopper and right in front of the window, you do neck back down. So, you're not going to necessarily have a bottleneck because you still have just one through lane per direction. But in that area where you don't have a turn lane in the middle of the road, those left turn vehicles do impede your through traffic a little bit more, which is an issue that we have in segments, portions of the piece that we have been really focused on, which is both, to some degree, an operational and congestion concern, also a safety concern because somebody's not anticipating somebody stopping to turn left into a driveway or an entrance. All of a sudden, you have a potential rear end, or if it's 3 cars up ahead, the first person may slow down and stop, but it's that sort of second or third person back who didn't see the blinker and just isn't paying attention. But it's not, if we had that 5-lane alternative and we came and we ended it here, then all of a sudden, yes, you may push a lot more traffic down and then it still has to come back together, raises the risk of a new bottleneck that backs towards, continues to back up towards the west.
And in terms of right away, do you have a sense of with the 2 lanes plus the turn lane alternative and the multi-use path, what the impact would be on homes or businesses? How many of them would
we have
be displaced?
From a displacement standpoint, we looked at it sort of in partial impacts to a property, which is perhaps we need to acquire some land versus what maybe a fully impacted site. Based on what we're looking at the current level of detail, we have one location that we think may be a complete impact. It's actually at the corner of Howard Drive and Pocahontas Trail. Is the old abandoned barbershop. That's the only site where it's a very small parcel.
There anyway.
Right. But yeah, elsewhere, we think that with some good engineering and adjusting that alignment around, that we can minimize that potential for complete impacts to folks that may result in a displacement. But there will be a number, pretty substantial number of individual property owners where we will need to get some right-of-way or at least easements for utilities or temporary construction easements. So that's going to be there will be folks impacted along the corridor. We tried to be very sensitive to that through the process because in some areas the right-of-way may be a little wider. That's not the individual property that they own, but if they're mowing the grass and maintaining that whole area as part of their yard, there's still that feeling that perhaps they're losing something.
Right.
Big part of why we put this together with those ground level views was to show what that exchange would be if maybe you are losing some property, but you're getting back an area where you can safely walk or bike and as part of that community amenity. So people could hopefully visualize and see what some of those trade-offs mean.
And there was one young man at one of the public meetings who was just purchased a home. He's got a young family, and he was absolutely thrilled that this might encroach on his yard because he wanted that amenity of having that multi-use path, out there. So.
Quick question, if I may. In that segment D, where it's already there's no room for emergency to pull off, how do you accommodate during construction to make sure that you've got enough room for fire trucks or whatever to get through there?
That's going to be, maintaining traffic through construction, any of these segments is going to be challenging. The thing that's sort of working in our favor is we are widening out, and I think in that area we're going to widen enough to one side versus the other that we can do some work sort of outside of the existing roadway, maintain the existing roadway, get a portion of the new road in place, shift folks over, and then sort of work on the other side then. But that is absolutely going to be a challenge, and we'll need to be very, very carefully coordinated as part of the detailed engineering, how all that would interface. But that absolutely needs to be part of all the considerations for how you truly sequence this. Within a segment, how are you going to do the actual work to make sure that we continue to move those vehicles through? There are some options in that area. There is some connectivity in the neighborhood, through the neighborhood. So sort of absolutely as a sort of a fallback option, there is some connectivity for those vehicles to get through. And they do that today sometimes now. If they have to get through, they can use some of your neighborhood routes on the to respond to an emergency.
Thanks.
Now, was Dominion included in any of this? Their rep come to the meeting or asked, hey, would y'all, we're possibly going down this direction. Is there any grants or is there, I know Dominion had stated a while back, as we do roads, they would rather the utilities be buried at that time rather than put up poles because it's easier on them. It's better for the community. It's a better look. And so if they haven't, we probably ought to get one of their reps involved and say, hey, we want you to partner up and start them out early and, kind of grease those wheels as we move through this process.
That's a really good point, Michael. And I think something for us to think about with our legislative program for this coming year is some kind of action on the part of the General Assembly to encourage the State Corporation Commission to allow Dominion to do more undergrounding because they turned down a more aggressive approach that had been suggested by Dominion recently. So,
and they kept funds too, didn't they? We can bury some.
And the strategy that they seem to be pursuing seemed to me to be wrong-headed because they were basically saying we're going to do the undergrounding in the places where that last house is being affected. And I would assume that what we want to see is undergrounding where the most homes and businesses are going to be able to maintain power, and you won't have to send as much out to deal with it after a storm.
Mm-hmm. But that's the time to do it when you're doing that road, put it on the ground at that time. And that would benefit them as well. I would think that would keep costs down.
I thought one of the neat things about the Long Hill project is where the JCSA is taking an opportunity to install a larger pipe down there. Are we considering something like that for the corridor?
JCSA was part of our technical committee at our last meeting. We discussed with them, and there is some maintenance work that needs to be done that they were interested in partnering and doing some lining of the pipes here. I think the capacity and the size is sufficient from their perspective, but there were some maintenance of some other things that it would make sense to piggyback, and they would be willing to work with the project as part of that.
Thank you.
So there.
Any other comments?
I just had a quick question. On the pedestrian discussion, was it really centered on movement within the community, or was it to get from say Windy Hill up towards Busch Gardens? What was the expectation?
It was a little bit of both. I mean, there are folks who bike to work at Busch Gardens or at Walmart at the distribution center. So there are folks that are using, walking or biking to sort of as a commuting method means. But it's really from the community of just trying to, if you live on the south side of Pocahontas Trail today, it's really hard just to get to 7-Eleven to go grab a soda or, and then if you want to try to cross the street to go visit friends. So it was really the community aspect, moving within the community, and then some of that, getting to areas outside and access to jobs for those folks who may not have a car. There's a lot of folks who do use the bus currently on this corridor, making it easier for them to get to and from transit stops as well.
Yeah, we've had 2 pedestrians hit on this stretch in the last few years.
Right. They were both in that segment D area as well.
Now, the reason why I was asking is I was wondering if there were segments, or if there were portions of this, such as segment A and maybe E1 and E2, where there wasn't as much of a need on the southern side of the street to then be able to have, if we wanted to accommodate a wider road or a different solution rather than having the sidewalk and the bike path, is there a benefit to having just the multi-use trail on one side and nothing on the far side to ease construction or improve expenses, or just a better way to manage the process?
Yeah, there's absolutely some potential opportunities. In front of Carter's Grove, we have a long stretch where the only thing on the south side is the Carter's Grove property. So there's that consideration. We talked about that with the community a little bit and with the steering committee. Maybe that's something that gets deferred to help cut down costs. The sidewalk itself as a cost item is not that large of a figure, but if there's some things we can perhaps avoid, if there's a utility conflict that perhaps goes away because we're not doing that work, then the savings may be more substantial. The community had some concerns with if you don't have the continuous facilities on both sides, then someone may need to cross the road once, walk down, and then cross back. So the sort of forcing, perhaps crossing the road multiple times to get to the same destination. Folks do live on the south side and they need to get to the elementary school or the community center, sort of not having that continuous path. So there was some concern, but there is some opportunity there, certainly from a technical standpoint, to perhaps defer that sidewalk in segments.
One of the main reasons for that in front of Carter's Grove and down that way is for the bus, for folks that ride the bus to be able to get off. Right now, they get off in a ditch or they're walking and you can't, it's not any way handicap accessible or any of that. And so it allows them to have the pull off in a sidewalk and they can build a shelter.
Okay. You think that in another life you were the interim director of WADA?
Yeah. I had one last one is in the Long Hill project, one of the things that I know that the VDOT folks had to do is put in a BMP at that Long Hill and Old Town area and ended up going into the community. Are you going to have drainage issues like that where you're going to end up with a BMP in those areas and then teamed with our own stormwater folks to divert it some other way?
Yeah, there will definitely, this project will require stormwater management, whether that's through the use of, a sort of traditional BMP. There's various options to consider. We haven't designed all those elements out at this level of engineering. We've accounted for that as part of our costs to make sure that the project budget would be sufficient to accommodate that, but the specific stormwater approach would need to be fleshed out further. What we did look at was to make sure that if you did it in segments, each segment you could control, you could handle the stormwater needs within that independent segment. So,
okay.
Yeah, it would be very important. It will be very important to coordinate with those other drainage agreements to make sure it all ties together.
Especially in the D area.
Yes.
I've got a couple things. Of course, I'd love to see the project from start to finish be done at one time. It would be a big savings, but as Paul and I both know, that transportation funds are tight. But maybe with the gas prices going up like they are, maybe they'll loosen up a little. That's a good and bad thing. Has anybody reached out to the owner of Carter's Grove and see if he wants, or they want to, whoever owns it, wants any involvement in the game here, and see if maybe it's something they may want to help out with to enhance this road in front of that beautiful plantation. And then I'd love to see our WY Daily and Virginia Gazette, talk about this a little bit more, and also promote the fact that with the new road coming, we don't know when, but with the new road coming, possibly that would entice maybe a grocery store in that area that would, be able to get in and out, and other people would be able to utilize it. So maybe help out the neighborhood in a way, and our newspapers and media could probably help us with that. I may not get it, but, we can always fish for it.
The Carter's Grove question, the owners or representatives of the owners for Carter's Grove did attend at least the most recent workshop that we had in April. We talked to them very briefly. They had some thoughts about their entrances and making sure how things would coordinate with their entrances. And then there's also the Virginia Outdoor Foundation, because there is a conservation easement as part of that property. So they have reached out as well. The county staff has responded back to initiate some coordination with them, because it's really any sort of property impacts on that property. You both have the individual property owner and the outdoor foundation, so you sort of have two entities that need to be coordinated with for potential impacts in that area. We did not get into the discussion with Carter's Grove about them perhaps participating or assisting in any of the improvements, but they are aware of the project. They did come out and engage at the most recent workshop.
There's a fair amount of active infill development going on right now. Are we kind of keeping an eye on any applications that are coming in for constructing a home, for instance, or something like that might have an impact?
Yeah, it'd be a little bit difficult to do and already platted lots with single-family homes. The last sort of big commercial one we had, of course, was the Dollar General, and that sort of just preceded some of these details. So we built in some more general language, but certainly the importance of having this as an adopted plan or accepted plan will help strengthen those discussions and negotiations as we move forward, for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to, one last thing, just add that as a participant in this process, RK&K have worked great with the planning staff. You guys are excellent at communicating, and there's been robust attendance by steering committee members and as well as the public involvement. And it's been very thorough and very detailed process. One more thing that came up several times during the meetings was that, fingers crossed, as 64 widens, when there are incidents, well, hopefully there'll be fewer incidents, but when there are incidents, there'll be more room for these vehicles to get around the the stoppage. So hence, hopefully we don't have as much traffic problems on 60. And the other thing is the Skiffs Creek connector. We heard from the public quite often that they were, sort of sick and tired of so many large semis coming through there, and with the families and such, so that the hope is that some of that traffic will come out of those distribution centers and go across to 143. Yep. So, anyway, but it's been great working with you guys. Good process.
As Mr. Zari mentioned at the beginning of the schedule, we never want to make you all feel rushed or obligated to send something through. We are going to try to get this scheduled on your agendas because the 2018 Smart Scale application season starts here in 2 weeks and runs for the next couple of months, and that does sort of represent the potential, trying to manage expectations, the potential for a larger pot of money compared to some of the other VDOT funding cycles. So we want to be relatively aggressive and smart about getting something in. Otherwise, we have to wait for 2 years. Those cycles only run every other year. So we want to try to get something in this year. And again, having this adopted plan.
Yeah.
And while we're on it, give everybody a little information with transportation. You put out a 6-year plan, and then you put out your next plan. And as Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel is taking shape, that's going to change the direction. And we're starting a conversation now with the groups. It's going to change the direction of of where people travel. Most people go, I'm not going to Hampton Bridge Tunnel. I'll go to Monterey Merrimack because I know that's always jammed up. When they know they can get through there, that's going to relieve the others and relieve congestion. And that's what we're working with. And Paul and I both are working in different areas to try to go, okay, we're going to have to look at that 6-year plan, because how good that was 4 or 5 years ago with this new improvement is going to change that. That is multiple years of work to get to that point, but we're already starting to plan and look at that and where we need to go. Just give you a little fill in on what we're doing on, the TPO and PDC and HR TAC and all that as far as planning and what we're going to see. Well, once we relieve one area, that changes all the congestion throughout the area. So that a need here may not be a need now, and it may be a need for this. So we may take up another larger project and be able to cut it up to do smaller projects. So we're looking at it. Of course, I'll keep my eye on James City County. Don't you worry about that.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. That brings us to Mr. Porter is going to introduce our agenda item number 4, which is legislative case deferral policy. Mr. Porter?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that the board did back in 2012 was to develop a legislative deferral policy. One of the first things when I came here, I saw that there was a land use issue that had come up that's been deferred twice, and now will go to August. And it seems to me that that's something that the Planning Commission may want to consider, is to develop a policy similar to what the board has for deferral. Because what happens lots of times is that deferral stretches it out, and citizens kind of get tired, or they're not watching, or it happens to come up in the middle of vacation time, that sort of thing, so that you can kind of wait out. And it seems to me that if a case is not ready and it has to be deferred for a long time, then perhaps it needs to come back all over again and give people the time, the developers the time to put all their things together. So I just thought that this would be a good time to talk to the Planning Commission with the possibility of developing and adopting a deferral policy.
I think I'd like to add that when we did this before, we were getting quite a few cases back in the day where something would roll out and you would get a series of requests for deferral, and some of them for legitimate reasons. And it was pretty obvious when you got to the point where there was maybe some public resistance, and it was a little bit of a gamesmanship being played. We'll get everybody fired up to go out and protest this at the Planning Commission or at the board meeting, and then it gets deferred at the last minute. Everybody shows up and there's nothing on the agenda. And you do that to them 2 or 3 times, and it sort of takes the wind out of the sails of opposition. If there's a legitimate reason in my mind for a deferral, which they bring forward, then I don't have any problem at all approving that. But I think what our policy was, we wanted to make it the option of the board to say, we think you've got exhausted your legitimate reasons, and we think it either needs to go forward now or you need to start over again. And I think that's maybe we haven't had quite as many of these in the past couple of years as they likely have coming up again. So that's an issue. I think that we've got a policy in place for it. It might be helpful if you guys considered something like that as well.
We had already broached the subject at our most recent policy committee meeting, just offhandedly in discussion, the concept of it in general. And I think that gives us an opportunity to have the conversation internally to see what we can come up with.
All right. Any other comments, requests, interests from the Board of Supervisors?
Matter of interest that just kind of, one of those random things that you wonder when you can pop this into the discussion. A few years ago, we had an application, and the application involved possibly a gas station adjacent to water supply. and it turned out that we didn't really have any restriction on any buffering requirements in that particular instance. And I would like to maybe see if there can be some preliminary exploration done about adding that to our county ordinance.
You're looking at like a distance, X amount of between
yes,
it.
yep, just so that there's less possibility of contamination of
Right.
drinking water supplies, rivers,
Would
streams.
that be just gas stations? Would it be propane stations?
I would think any contaminant that, just at least to consider the possibility.
Would that roll into just thinking while we're talking?
Yeah.
Would that roll into say repair shops, since there are vehicles and storage and that sort of thing on the outside? Would that, to give the planning commission something to?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would think would make sense would be to start off by doing a look at best practices around and see what other communities have done, and then go from there. My understanding was Newport has such a restriction. We don't. It's off a red flag in my mind.
And I would think they could look at potentially any source of contamination. That would be a factor.
So I say we're going to, do something. We might want to look at what do we consider, what would be considered, so that y'all have a better concept of. I thought they just meant a gas station. No, you might have to look deeper into, what other localities are doing and, protect the water.
Right.
What did you mean by water supply? Is it, are you
In
referring
this
to
particular case,
a well?
it was a reservoir.
A reservoir, okay. Could it be a well also, or a?
Could be. I mean, I guess my inclination was to say we don't have anything in place right now that would address the issue that was in front of us at that point. So that's where I started from. But I think that it'd be worth taking a look at the broader question.
I think the only tool we had available to us was to require them to have a spill prevention plan versus, storage of, bulk storage of solvents or gasoline or those types of things that you might find with a gas station or industrial uses. And I think that's what we're talking about.
Well, if it go down to like wells, you're trying more of like reservoirs, stream beds, water bodies, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Being able to transfer down.
Are there any other ordinances that there's any desire to ask the planning commission to look at?
I think this is one where I would like to try to bring up a question that I'd like to see if we can maybe have staff and planning commission look at it. I've talked to some of my fellow board members, but not all. And it has to do with density transfer master plans. And we've had a recent case in Ford's Colony where, they came in and made a proposal, and the staff was looking at, moving numbers from one land bay to another land bay, and it created quite a consternation in the community, especially since the person making the observation that they wanted to do it didn't have a controlling interest or ownership in the property, and ostensibly taking units that did belong to them. But what it goes back to is our current practice that we set up, and I believe, Paul, you told me that we had done this years ago, where we set up the policy that you would make a decision, and that if there was an appeal on something like this particular one, and this is, I'm talking specifically with master plans and land bay use transfers, not necessarily other issues, but specifically that. And then of course, if there was an appeal, it would go to the DRC. I had one recently like that with Stonehouse, but Stonehouse is one. Ford's Colony was one. There was one in Newtown. Some of you may remember Founders Village. They were scrabbling for every last unit they could get from place to place. And what I'm thinking is that, a master plan sets an expectation for a community. When I bought into Ford's Colony, it was 2,500 units. It's now 3,200 or 3,250 or something like that. But at every step of the way, when this master plan changed, there was an amendment process that we went through, and the public had an opportunity to weigh in, if you will. And everybody in my community has pretty well accepted those changes that were, because they had a chance to buy into it. I think what my concern is that if there are possibilities where we could have changes to a master plan by moving units around within it that might substantially affect what the expectation of people who lived in that community thought it was going to be, that it probably ought to come back instead of to the DRC. It probably ought to come back to the legislative body. And the reason being is because we're the ones who had to approve the master plan to begin with. And this would be an opportunity, if there was a concern in the community, at least we could have it back where the public could then comment to and hold the elected officials accountable for actions on that. And so I'm sort of leaning toward seeing if there's any kind of consensus to look at these potential land transfers, density transfers, and master plans to come back to the board as opposed to the DRC, without casting any aspersions at all on the DRC.
Would that go through the Planning Commission en route to the board?
I would think that it would do like any other ordinance amendment. We would start it, and if there's consensus among my fellow
Do you
board
make
members.
changes to the master plan amendment if somebody's proposing a change?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We was talking about when a case came. If we did the change you're suggesting,
yes,
would it still go through the Planning Commission process
yeah.
it came to the?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would both. I would think so. But what it would do is it would put the ultimate responsibility for that decision on the elected officials.
That would also reopen public hearings and
precisely.
Well, that would make so much sense in terms of what we just experienced with Stonehouse.
You watched that?
Yes,
that was very interesting.
Our hands
That
were
was
kind of
unique.
tied with Stonehouse. That was tough.
Yeah. Well, but those are the rules that we had in place. Okay, and so it made me think about not just that issue, but where we've had this similar kind of problem with previous master plans. It might be beneficial to change in that particular instance to change the ultimate.
But you're talking about going through the same process as a rezoning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be a formal master plan amendment process, which is then what would trigger the public input versus keeping it a master plan consistency determination to include both the PCN board, which would not trigger the public hearing. I think I'm hearing
distinction. Yeah,
there may be consensus for the former.
Yep. Yep. And the only other thing I had, and it is maybe it's just for staff, but is it possible that we can get a discussion of PDR on our June work session, or is that going to be too difficult to do? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Good?
I'm good.
Everybody good?
Yeah, good.
All right. Do you have any closing remarks, Mr. Richardson?
No, ma'am. Thank you. No closing remarks. Thank you again for your time and some of the suggestions here as we work the rest of the year. It's always a pleasure. And Mr. Hipple, if you can get us all some Hampton Roads pins when you're out there, that'd be awesome. Thanks for your efforts.
Yes, sir.
And please keep the channels of communication open. If there's any questions, anything that you may need from any of us, please do let us know. Thank you.
And definitely vice versa. If things are coming up that you all feel that need to be looked at, and you can let us know as well. I know that Mr. Haldeman and I were doing pretty good at communication, and then life happened. So, but we try to check in, and I think if we can all check in with each other, that's really helpful, and hopefully can get us towards some movement. And I think this was a very productive meeting, and appreciate all the effort that everybody put into it and all the work as well. So thanks, staff, as well.
I have one other question, and Mr. Holt, this was sort of crossing my mind as I was driving down here today. We don't have a whole lot going on, but there are probably some things percolating in your end of the world that you know about that are coming our way that we may or may not know about. What I was thinking is that if you get an opportunity, a very simple, short, one page or outline or something periodically to the Planning Commission and to the board of what is being put into the in basket.
That's easy. We've got a planning director's report.
Because there are times when something like that, you're aware of it, you're working it, maybe the Planning Commission starts to become aware of it, and board members, it's not on our radar yet, but it's helpful, especially if things start picking up again, to have an opportunity to start paying attention to that a little further out.
Yeah, that's easy. We've got a monthly report that I send out as part of each Planning Commission packet. We'll dial in with another mailing out to the board. Everything's sorted by district. Sure. Everything has an address to it. Everything has a brief description. So that's Perfect. A really good synopsis. We can grow it from there. Yeah. But we'll start to dial into all that.
That'd be tremendously helpful.
Paul, does that include site plans?
It's everything.
Okay.
It's across the board. So.
Yeah.
More paper. Much more paper.
All right. Thank you.
More electrons.
Another email.
Anyone else? Could I ask for a motion?
Well, we're going to let you adjourn yours first.
Indeed.
Yes.
Ask for a motion to adjourn the Planning Commission.
So moved.
We're
adjourned.
We're adjourned.
All right. With that, we are going to, is there any further business with the board? Okay. With that, we're going to adjourn until 5 p.m. on June 12th, 2018 for our regular meeting. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
All right, thank you. Mr. Porter, you call the roll.
We're not here.
Mr. Bennett?
Aye.
Staffenhouse?
Aye.
Mr. Hippel? Aye. Ms. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Larson?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Radar check.
So we're divided into 3 different shifts. So you're on for 4 hours and you're off for 8. And during those 4 hours of you being on, you're basically going to be doing any